This is an unofficial and unauthorized translation of a Figu publication. 208th Contact. Tuesday, April 8, 1986, 5:27 a.m. Billy says, on the Great Journey, I spoke with Patha about the fact that the earthly scientists still haven't figured out what actually causes fear in people, respectively where the actual origin is to be sought for this. Unfortunately, this conversation was not kept and, thus, was not recorded. Can you, perhaps, mention again the three most important factors through which fear can arise in its origin? Quetzal says, on the one hand, fear can be genetically conditioned, but on the other hand, it can also be caused by a wrong upbringing, as well as by ignorance and misconceptions. Billy says, so also by imagination and fantasy? Quetzal says, that is correct. Billy says, as Patha explained to me, fear if it is not corrected and if it arises in the form of ignorance, misconceptions, imagination, and fantasy may have effects on the genes and, consequently, program these over time, by what means fear then appears via the genes and becomes inheritable, as this is also the case with many other things, from which some degenerations and also evolutionary values can emerge. A fact, as Patha explained, that is still unknown to the earthly scientists, however, and that will only be recognized in the future, which shouldn't be too far off anymore. Quetzal says, that, too, is correct. Billy says, then a question concerning aggression. Patha told me that the so-called neurotransmitter, serotonin, restrains aggression. The greater the amount of serotonin is in the brain of the person, the less aggressive the person would be. Did I understood this correctly? Quetzal says, what you said is correct. Billy says, nice. Recently, you said that scientists were working at full speed all around the Earth on decoding the DNA of different animals and humans. Quetzal says, I spoke of that, yes. Experiments and researches of this kind have already run in various laboratories of many earthly countries for many years, whereby also some successes were achieved. However, the coming time will very quickly bring more successes in this connection, whereby it will probably be around the turn of the millennium that the entire Earth human DNA will be decoded. But already years prior to this, the relevant progresses and successes will lead to this and be constantly developed and refined, such that through this, the awareness of crimes will increase in a rising measure. Billy says, DNA, genetic engineering, and everything connected therewith will inevitably lead in the coming time to enormous changes and progresses in a variety of scientific and technological fields. Medical science will benefit from this tremendously, as well as the biological and technical sciences. So you said. Quetzal says, you remember correctly. The aforesaid is correct. Billy says, for my part, Svath taught me that there are various forms of human intelligence and, thus, not just one type. Thus, he explained that there is an emotional intelligence, a thought-feeling intelligence, and a creative intelligence, along with a musical intelligence, an intellectual intelligence, an individual intelligence, and a general intelligence. Further, he also mentioned idea intelligence, fantasy intelligence, and character intelligence, as well as consciousness intelligence, but these are not all of the manifestations. All forms of intelligence taken together, namely in their full value, result in the actual intelligence quotient. The higher the quotient is, the more intense and the higher the speed of thought is, with the maximum speed of thought being the speed of light. And the higher the person's speed of thought and combination is, the higher his intelligence should be. This all seems clear and also logical to me, in complete contrast to the so-called IQ tests, which are made by pompous earthly psychologists, etc. As to the question, what is to be made of these tests? Quetzal says, the use of these intelligence quotient tests among the earthly psychology practitioners is well known to me. Unfortunately, I must describe these tests as extremely deficient and as just as wrong as the psychology that is applied by the psychologists, which, for the most part, does not truly correspond to such but rather only to illusions and false diagnoses, by which entirely wrong analyses and attestations are very often made. Billy says, which very often leads to the fact that, for example, rapists and murderers, etc., are released from penal institutions or insane asylums as being cured and are released upon humanity again, after which they then commit similar new and often even worse crimes. Quetzal says, unfortunately, that is a word of truth, which also proves the actual inability of those who presumptuously call themselves psychologists and who are of the crazy belief that with their underdeveloped knowledge of psychology, would stand above others and would be able to judge these psychologically. Billy says, a harsh word. Quetzal says, but it corresponds to the truth. Billy says, I think that you, as a doctor and scholar of psychology, are able to judge very well. Quetzal says, that is correct. Billy says, of course. Your explanations are consistent with those of Sfath and Patha, who also spoke so well as you. Sfath was, among other things, a physician and, thus, an excellent doctor and scholar of psychology, as well as Patha his sum, that is. Through Sfath's outstanding medical knowledge, I was preserved from death by him at the age of 6 months. Also, his knowledge of psychology was always extremely valuable and useful for me. Quetzal says, that is known to me. Billy says, do you still have time to answer one more question for me, if you can answer it at all? Quetzal says, a few minutes still remain for me, before I have to resume my duties which are laid on me. Billy says, Jacobus asked me about original Switzerland, respectively about when people operated agriculturally in Switzerland for the first time. He was actively trained in agriculture and is just interested in it. He supposes that the lake dwellers all really worked in agriculture or horticulture in some form. Do you have any knowledge of this? Patha told me that you occupy yourself with the original history of Switzerland and Europe. Quetzal says, Patha's statement corresponds to the truth. Jacobus' supposition is false, however, because these were not lake dwellers who first engaged in agriculture and horticulture in Switzerland and in other parts of Europe, but these were northern and northeastern immigrants, who appeared about 11,000 years ago and who cultivated the country over several millenniums, lived in so-called longhouses, together with cattle and dogs, etc., but who still engaged in hunting. But now, my friend, it is that time for me. Until we meet again. Billy says, bye. The end.